podcasts.
Everyone's favourite satirist Adrian Plass pens a new sacred diary for the latest edition of Premier Christianity magazine with his unique take on the phenomenon of the Christian festival. Plus, we ask, how should believers respond to identity politics? Is smoking the cardinal sin it's often made out to be? Hugh Ross tells how astrophysics brought him face-to-face with the Creator, and we bring you a special report on the megachurch movement in the USA, going behind the scenes of 6 of America's biggest churches. All that plus much more. Ask for your free edition at premierchristianity.com/free sample.
The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Where faith comes to life.
Hello and welcome to the Profile podcast with me, Sam Hales. It's a special edition of the show today because we're digging back into the archives for an interview I conducted in 2016 with Banning Liebscher. The interview went out on Premier Christian Radio in 2016, but it has not been released until now on the Profile podcast, so we wanted to put it out for you. Really interesting interview with the founder of Jesus Culture. You may know Jesus Culture as the band, but they're actually a movement. They have some influence here in the UK as well, running conferences, partnering with other churches. As Banning says in this interview, he actually sometimes gets mistaken for being the sound man for the band, but he is actually the man who heads up the movement, and he talks at length in this interview about his own testimony and really his vision for Jesus Culture, not just as a church, as a movement, but also about how they're wanting to bless churches in the UK. So let's listen in. Hello and welcome to The Profile here on Premier Christian Radio. I'm Sam Hales and today I'm speaking to Banning Liebscher. Banning is the founder of Jesus Culture, which is a global movement aiming to raise, equip and mobilise Christians worldwide. Banning, welcome to the programme.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So I wondered, we always start on the profile by asking about someone's background. So tell me a bit about what life was like growing up for you.
What was life like growing up for me? Well, I'm from California. I'm from a smaller town up in Northern California. And, grew up in a Christian home, a pretty conservative Baptist Christian home. So grew up with some good roots and got saved legitimately. I remember, sitting in my mom's lap when I was 4 years old and asking Jesus into my heart and getting baptized. But it wasn't until I was 17 that we started attending this church and I started getting involved in the youth group. And I was saved, but it hadn't fully become my own as far as a relationship. And when I was 17 years old, I started going to this youth group. The youth pastor invited me to come to a night service. I came out to a night service. He spoke a message. I still remember to this day. And he did he asked for a response for the sermon. Mm-hmm. And I was 17 years old, and all I remember is I got up, I went forward, I knelt down, and I said, God, if I'm going to do this Christianity thing, I'm going to do it 100%. Mm. And everything changed that night.
Wow.
Everything changed. Like, I went home that night, and I said, Mom, I want to preach. That's what I want to do with my life. And that was my senior year of high school, the last year of high school for me, and I just went for it. Started bringing everybody I could to church, started going to church, read the Bible in a year, just kind of dove straight in.
Yeah.
And just really the Lord really lit me up in a big way and really encountered that I'm a leader and all that stuff. So then went to college and then came back, got on staff at a church at 19 and was on staff for 18 years.
Wow, that's fantastic. I mean, a lot of times you meet people who grew up in a Christian background and they have a great story like that, but then they go away to college and it all goes wrong a little bit. But it was, you kept on the straight and narrow. Yeah,
well, I think the Lord got a hold of my heart right before I went. I probably would have had the same story except for whatever reason, I don't know why that night, just the Lord really got a hold of my heart, and I knew this is what I want to do. I don't want to live half-hearted. I don't want to kind of give a little bit. I want to give everything, and it's been the craziest ride of my life. It's been the best ride of my life. I just can't imagine living any other way.
At what point were you at Bethel? Were you at Bethel all of this time?
I was at, it was actually at Bethel that I started getting involved in the youth group when I was 17. Right. This is 1993, if you can imagine that. And in 1995, I came back and actually came on staff, started interning, then got hired.
Right.
And then I was youth pastor at Bethel I was there with youth ministry for about 12 years and then another 6 years. Mm-hmm. A lot of people may not know. I don't know how much people know about Jesus Culture, but the worship of Jesus culture was just coming out of our youth group.
Yeah.
So Kim, Walker Smith, Chris Kilala, they were just in the youth group.
Yeah.
So Chris, who he's 33 now, he was 12 years old. He was in my wedding when he was 14. So he was like a groomsman. He's 14. Kim had just turned 18 and moved to Reading and was serving in the youth group. So all of this stuff for us came out of that.
Yeah. And Bethel Church is a congregation we hear quite a lot about in the UK. I think a lot of people have heard of Bill Johnson's ministry, and we hear these amazing stories of healings and signs and wonders. And so you were leading the youth group.
Yes.
For a long period of time.
Yes.
And did you see those kind of amazing healings and signs of wonders in the youth group as well as the adults?
Yeah, absolutely. We would see kids that would go to school, simple stories like a kid that has to have a shot for like diabetes or whatever else. There's stories like this on the football field or our American football field, or a kid that needed to go to the nurse's station because they weren't feeling well because they hadn't had their shot. And one of our kids walks with them, prays with them, runs into him 3 days later, and she says, I haven't had a shot in 3 days. I feel great. So, a ton of stuff. And a lot of the conferences, early days, when we started doing Jesus Culture conferences, we would send everybody out onto the streets, the entire conference, all the young people. We just say, go out into the streets for 3 hours and just go find people to pray for. And they would come back with the craziest stories. They'd come back with the stories of going into somebody's apartment and somebody had massive scoliosis, was in pain in bed from it, getting completely healed, people on walkers and wheelchairs, and some of the craziest stories would just come back, deaf ears opening up. These kids would just go on the streets and they would just start praying for people. Wow. And the Lord started showing up and healing them. And they'd come back. We'd all be surprised. Yeah. These are your testimonies. We're like, are you serious? That happened? So, that's how it all started in the early days.
So Jesus Culture was birthed really kind of out of Bethel. Jesus Culture was the youth ministry of Bethel. And it started with a conference, really, didn't it?
Yeah. Well, we had a youth group. And then in 1999, we decided to put on a conference. And we called it Jesus Culture. It was, the whole thing started actually because we named a conference Jesus Culture.
Right, okay.
And we started doing that twice a year. And what we began to realize was, one, there was something very special on the worship. I don't know how to describe it, but it was like people were just really meeting with the Lord and their lives were being changed in worship. And we knew like something's happening. In fact, when we recorded our first album, that's how we recorded it. If you go back to some of our first albums, they're super raw and they're all just covers of other songs. Because what we were trying to do, we were trying to say, listen, we want to see if we record these conference worship times, maybe somebody else would encounter the Lord like we are in these times. And so it didn't matter what song we were singing. If that was where we felt the Lord was moving, we put that on the CD. Yeah. And so still to this day, some of my favorite testimonies are people that are like, I don't know what it is, but every time I put on a CD of yours in worship, I encountered the Lord in a significant way, because that's the whole reason why we did at the beginning. Yeah, so it was a conference, worship, and then in 2005, we actually came to England. In 2005, we felt like we're supposed to take these conferences out. So we went to Atlanta, and we went to Rugby, England. Had about 120 people come to St. Mark's Church or something like that, and it was a pretty special time.
Amazing. And for those who don't know, tell me the story about how the Jesus Culture name came about. It's a cool story.
Well, yeah, it's isn't it funny how much more anticlimactic it really is, and how simple. We had a conference, and we were really trying to think of a name. So I was walking through a mall, and I saw there's like a skater brand called Counterculture over in America, and there was this kind of like this skater shop. And it just said Counterculture. I was just sitting there going, I love that concept. At the time we were only dealing with teens. I love that concept of seeing a generation that's countercultural. But I thought, I don't want to just be countercultural. I want it to be a Jesus culture. I'm not just looking for like just a revolution for revolution. We really want to see a Jesus culture raised up, not just a counterculture generation. So that's what we named it, and people were like, what are you calling it? All right, okay. And then, but I don't know why, it just stuck.
That's brilliant.
Years later, it's still there.
It's still, yeah.
And then in the early days, we just named everything Jesus Culture. Literally, people are like, we're like, we'll name a conference Jesus Culture. I wrote a book named Jesus Culture. We have a band. We named it Jesus Culture. Everything was just Jesus Culture.
And it continues to this day. And we'll talk about this in a minute, but you do have now a church called
Yes.
Jesus Culture.
Yeah,
as
that's
well.
exactly right.
So it just carried on.
Actually, funny story about that. We planted a church, and most people would only know us as a worship movement.
Yeah.
So we had some visitors come, and they're like, I didn't know you had a church. And I thought it was really weird that you named the church after your band. Almost like we call it Jesus Culture Sacramento. They almost like, why would you call it Newsboys Sacramento? You know,
Brilliant.
Awesome.
So quite quickly over the years, this went from being something at Bethel to being, as you described, this international movement with conferences all over the US and now all over the world. What was it that enabled you to grow in that way? Because I think a lot of people on the outside looking in would say this appears to happen quite quickly. Okay, it was over a period of years, but within a very short period of time, you went from just being a youth group to being this kind of international movement.
Yeah, the music.
Yeah.
Well, I think we kind of did a couple things. It happened all at once. One, we started taking the conferences out. So we started visiting cities in the U.S., Atlanta and Dallas and Chicago, and started coming over to England. But it was really the worship that took off. It was a very interesting story about that because the second album that we recorded, Kim, who's been with us for a long time, she came back from North Carolina and said, hey, there's a song that I'd like to sing on this next album called How He Loves. A friend of ours, John Mark McMillan, had written it. And so we get together to do this album, and one of our guys says, let's record a DVD with it. And I'm not exaggerating this story. We're like, well, how do we do that? He's like, I don't know. Let's get some, let's borrow some video cameras and just record this. We're like, okay. So we just borrowed a bunch of video cameras. We literally asked, anybody got any video cameras? The guy's like, I got some. And so we put together this DVD. Kim sang How He Loves. And then maybe we release the album a few months later. Somebody calls me, and they said, did you know that somebody uploaded How He Loves on YouTube? Now, at the time, YouTube was not the marketing juggernaut it is right now. Like, it was like a place where you kind of upload your home videos for other people to see. Yeah. Like, we didn't even know to put something up on YouTube. Yeah. So they said somebody uploaded How He Loves on YouTube, and it's had 250,000 plays. And I was like, and that was unbelievable. That was like, I'm like, what? It's had 250,000 plays? Are you serious? Well, all of a sudden, that song took off. And then the worship took off. And then once the worship took off, people began to come to events and things like that. So it's funny because there literally was, it sounds horrible saying this, there was like no plan, no marketing, no like, hey, we're going to put this on YouTube, and then we're going to come out with this. We were just doing the best we can to follow Jesus and take the next step. And we thought, let's record a DVD. And then we didn't even, some kid put it up. I think illegally, too. Yeah. I'm not even sure he was supposed to. Like, he legally put it up on YouTube, and that's really where all of a sudden people start. That's also why most people would know as worship more than anything else.
That song, as you say, even though it's not even your song, Kim Walker-Smith didn't even write that song, and yet it does seem to have sort of catapulted the movement and still really, I think, still be a song that people will immediately associate with Jesus culture.
People still this day, and honestly for me, it's one of the most humbling things you can hear because this is what we wanted was people to encounter God. They still come up to me and they say, they said I did an entire year where every morning I played that song on YouTube and I just wept the entire time. Like the amount of people that still come up to me and say that song for me touched me in such a deep way, and so I love it.
The other big change that's happened, of course, is you have now got a church, which is in Sacramento, about 150 miles south of Redding. So tell me more about how that came about.
I'd never really thought about having a church. We had formed kind of a team. We had a staff we'd built in Redding and was really involved in the senior leadership team there and doing a bunch of stuff. And I got a phone call one day from a friend of mine who has a church who just started talking to me about maybe coming out and taking their church and kind of that process. We knew that it wasn't what we were supposed to do, but it just kind of sparked something in us that the Lord's kind of calling us to be sent. So we just sat down with our team and said, hey, I think the Lord's sending us. And so we just started praying into cities and where do you want us to go, God? What's this look like? And so 3 years ago, we were sent from Bethel. There was about 60 adults and 40 kids packed up and moved to Sacramento. We waited about a year and a half. So about a year and a half ago, we planted a church in Sacramento right outside the suburbs. And it's been an incredible, absolutely incredible. In fact, our latest album came from the church. We felt it was important that we would. So we just recorded on Sundays at the church, And it's been something special being down there. God's doing some really significant stuff in the area of unity in Sacramento. Churches are very connected, working closely together, very, very relationally knit together. And we've just had a blast.
Yeah.
Absolutely loved it. And it's been fun, too. I mean, we're planting a church with people that I've been doing life with for years. Years that we've been doing life together and ministry together. So to go down and actually plant a community of people who are going after worship, who are going after seeing cities impacted has been pretty special.
When you hear about big church movements planting new congregations in new places, one of the kind of criticisms that comes back is often, well, you've got a big name, a big brand like Jesus Culture. When you sort of rock up in a city, are you just going to have all the sort of young 20-something Christians leave their other churches? Is that something you're aware of or something you have to deal with?
You know, when we went in, a lot of our friends were like, "Hey, you need to be aware of this stuff." And so I'm not even sure. This is our hearts for. We're team players. Our hearts for the kingdom and the body of Christ. So that's naturally there. But I'm not even sure I fully planned this. But we knew we weren't supposed to plant right away. So I literally took 15 months and just jumped into the thing that was going on in the city. We hadn't even planted, and I'd make sure I was going to all the pastors' gatherings. I don't want to exaggerate, but I bet you I bet you in 15 months I had coffee or lunch with 30 different pastors, maybe more. Pastors in Sacramento were really, really gracious to me. So within a month of being there, about 15 of these kind of senior leader pastors in the region took me to lunch, and they said, "Hey, we're really glad that you're here. We believe that the Lord sent you. We want to reach a city, and we want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us. How can we help?" So when I came down into an environment that was pretty welcoming, and then I just jumped in. And so I think that there's always that tension of, you know, the name, the new shiny thing, all that type of stuff. But I think that people really, we had established relationships with these pastors. They knew me. So when I sat down, they knew that I cared. They knew that I'm for them. They knew that I'm for what's going on in the city. In fact, our launch service on Sunday, we had about 10 different pastors there that got up on stage, maybe about 6 from the area, that I literally said, "Would you come on stage our first Sunday, and would you pray a blessing over these?" So these are senior pastors from other churches. "Would you pray a blessing over our church?" Wow. And it was significant for me because, and I wasn't doing this just to jump through a hoop. I really genuinely believe that we're going to be reaping fruit that we didn't sow. That these men and women have been in Sacramento for years, and it's their tears, it's their labor, it's their work, and we're going to come in and we're going to reap some of their work that they've done. And I wanted to both honor that as well as understand these are the fathers and mothers in Sacramento, spiritually speaking, and we want a blessing as we come in. And probably my favorite part of our launch Sunday was when that group got up and prayed over us and just said some words about the thing. It was pretty special.
Is it hard, now that you are a local church leader as well as a sort of leader for a global movement, is it hard to balance those two things? Because obviously you do a lot of travelling, you're here in the UK at the moment, but you're also a pastor of a local church. How does that work?
Yeah, it's definitely been a different rhythm for sure. I mean, it's definitely been a different rhythm. So we didn't have to deconstruct anything. So when we planted the church, we immediately were able to communicate, hey, we're a local church that wants to impact a city that has a passion to change the world. So it was like, hey, the train you're getting on, we've got a passion. I mean, in fact, I just recorded a video that played on Sunday where I just talked to our church and said, hey, I'm in the UK this week. We have a mandate to partner with the UK. Our church has a mandate to invest in this nation and what God's doing here. And so I think that we're able to kind of bring them along so they understand, hey, we're not just a local church trying to reach a city. We are a local church that has a call to the nations as well. And so when our guys are out on tour, you know, going to arenas, they know that's us out there. Yeah. You know, we may, you know, the story of David, some stayed back with the luggage, you know, and some went out. Yeah. The reward's the same. Yeah. So our church has a concept that even though I'm stayed home in Sacramento and I'm not in the UK this week, that's still my reward that I'm getting. Sure. And whatever fruit comes from that. So I think we just were able to marry that early on. Yeah. And so they understand that, you know, they're not every single Sunday. I actually preach quite a bit there, but we have a team concept of people preaching and different things, and they've just bought into it pretty quick.
Yeah, and I guess with the worship as well, you mentioned having Jesus Culture, the band, out on tour.
Yes.
I guess that means you have even more of a responsibility to raise up other worship musicians.
Yes,
Otherwise, you have
absolutely.
no worship band on a Sunday.
Well, that's interesting. That's what's funny. Absolutely. It has made us very quickly make sure that we are developing and raising up other people. It's been one of the beautiful things for me, actually, is to see how strong the worship has become, even when the band, I'm doing air quotes, even when the band is out on tour, how strong the worship is.
Yeah. And I wonder for you personally, you already mentioned that people, when they think of Jesus Culture, they immediately think of the music.
Yeah.
Does that bother you?
Well, from a personal standpoint, from Banning Liebscher's standpoint, I'm actually quite grateful for it. I feel like the Lord's allowed me to be a part of something, but allowed me, like, it doesn't have my name on it. And for me, I think that was important. I shudder sometimes to think if it was, Banning Liebscher band, although that would never happen, but you get my point, The fact that I'm with these sons and daughters who are way more famous than I am, who have way more Twitter followers than I have, who everybody wants to see, for me personally, in my walk with the Lord, has been a really good thing. I've been very grateful that the Lord has done that. And I think that all of us have an understanding that this is way bigger than just one person, and we don't want it just to be one person. That we want this to actually be bigger than, so as a team, we're just better together. And absolutely, I could tell you a ton of funny stories, though, of people that are like, have no clue that there's anything else, have no clue who I am. We'll go out on tour and I'll get up to preach, and literally people are like, "What's going on right now? Who is this guy that's interrupting my favorite worship team? Why is he up there right now?" And so there's many, many stories of people thinking I'm the sound guy and all that stuff. But I actually think it's been great. It
keeps you humble. Is that what you're getting at?
Absolutely, in a really good way. And I've legitimately, I'm not just saying this, really, really grateful for it.
Yeah.
Whenever we're in Germany and they're like, "Hey, Kim's there and Chris, you're probably going to have to walk around the crowd." I'm like, "I'll be fine. I'll be able to walk through them. Trust me."
That's great. We talked earlier about your faith growing up and how for you it was really a very strong faith that continued. Do you ever have major doubts though?
I don't. Probably growing up, I did. Growing up, you ask those questions like, is what we believe real? What if there are other religions are just as right? What if we're wrong? Definitely growing up, I wrestled with that. But I think I've just seen the Lord do so much. He's just changed my life in such a significant way. I've seen him answer prayers. I've seen him heal bodies. I've seen him change hearts. It's unexplainable outside of the fact that this is God. There's kind of a little mini revival that's broken out in a prison in Texas that we've been involved with, and I went and visited these guys and sat down with about 50 of them and just heard their stories. And I remember these are like guys that are in for life, very violent, some of the toughest situations. I just sat and listened to their stories of what Jesus has done in their life. And just the love in their eyes and the joy in their heart. And some of them, they're never getting out of prison. And I remember walking away going, I believed in Jesus before. I believe in him even more now. Just seeing the transformation of somebody that was so broken, so hurting, so angry, so violent. And to see the love of Jesus really touch somebody at that level, I just don't know how. I'm like, I just can't,
Yeah.
It's just so real.
It's interesting, this word revivalists is used quite a lot by your movement, certainly from where Bethel's coming from. What does this word mean? We hear it a lot in kind of your circles, I guess.
Totally.
Being a revivalist,
what
is
that? In our circles, isn't it? We sometimes even hesitate using the word revival because it has such different meanings and connotations in different circles. I think for us, when we talk about a revivalist, we're talking about somebody who is completely sold out to the cause of Christ, that carries the presence of God wherever they go, has a passion for that. I think when we use the word revival, for me, there'd be different aspects. Obviously, I think first and foremost, and I think we use that word intentionally, not just because of we would understand like, well, I went to a revival once and it was a week-long, camp meeting type deal.
Yeah.
But that as you look back both biblically and through history, you see times where God moved in a very significant way, where he poured out his Spirit in Wales in 1904, and Azusa Street in 1906, and the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening. There was these moments of history, and we just think like that's still available. And so we use those words because of that. But for us, revival really would be, it would be around the presence of God coming in a significant way and changing people's lives and cities. It would be the church being awakened. That first love awakening, that surrendering everything, giving all for the cause of Christ. You hear about these Moravians that literally were so passionate about reaching people that they would sell themselves into slavery to reach slaves, So it's the presence of God. It's the church being awakened. And I would say it's sinners being saved. It's those that don't know Jesus, meeting Jesus. And then I would also say the fourth aspect for me would be culture transformed. It's one of the things, being over here in the UK, one of the things that so impresses me with William Booth and the birth of the Salvation Army is culture was impacted. Yeah. Society was transformed. Yeah. And so the heart, the passion that Booth carried actually manifested in practical, transformational ways. Yeah. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about that type of radical abandonment to God that the presence of God responds to, that the church is awakened by, that sinners are saved in, and that culture is transformed.
And have we seen that in recent years?
I think we've seen it in pockets. Obviously, you hear about different pockets in America experiencing pretty significant movements of salvation, whether it's the Browns revival, whether it's the Toronto outpouring with the presence of God and the love of God being poured out. And then we hear some pretty significant stuff around the world. One of the things that I'm not sure people fully realize, that the day we live in right now, God's moving in a really unprecedented way. If you look at, and some of these stats are going to be old, that I'm like 15 years old that I'm going to give you, but if you look at what's happening right now, there's prayer movements happening around the world. We're not talking about just one or two places. Entire stadiums are being filled with prayer. The 24/7 prayer movement to Pete Gregg. Prayer houses and prayer rooms and prayer businesses and churches are taking this on. There's signs and wonders, I think, are being released. It's not abnormal now for people to really actually believe that the Lord moves in that way. And then also salvations. There are more Muslims being saved today than any time in all of history. The statistics in China, just the statistics in China, which, again, these are older, they're even more now. They were saying that there was 1,200 people an hour coming to Jesus in China alone. And this is 15 years ago. That was happening for a decade straight. Yeah. If you look at China, if you look across Latin America, if you look throughout the continent of Africa, and I'll say this, even in Europe, the Lord is doing significant things. So I'm not sure we've fully seen the culmination of this in a way where we're seeing some of the things that we've read about yet. But God is on the move in a significant way, and it's pretty profound impact.
And it's really great to hear you talk internationally. And you said earlier that you believe that Jesus Culture has a mandate for the UK.
Yes.
And maybe sometimes it takes an outsider coming in to kind of show people who live here what's really going on. Because I think, honestly, most people... Well, not most people, but a lot of people are quite pessimistic about the church in the UK. We hear a lot about decline. We hear a lot about less people going to church than ever and the rise of secularism. But you've just said some very encouraging things that are happening worldwide, and you included Europe in that. And you've said you have a mandate for the UK. So tell me more about
we
that.
started coming over to the UK when I was 19 in 95. As Jesus Culture, we started coming over around 2006 for the last 10 years. Absolutely have seen the water level rise. Not because of us at all. I mean... And our heart's just to be over here to serve and partner with what God's doing in the churches. But absolutely have seen the water level rise of passion. A lot of people, it's very interesting. In America, we're encountering the same thing. They come out with statistics. People that don't associate with religion anymore is growing. This is growing. This is growing. But I think they're very misleading statistics, Because what we're finding is this: although people may associate less with church, because they associated with church before, doesn't necessarily mean that their heart was alive to God. So what we're finding is the depth of Christianity is growing. The passion in believers is growing. We were just here. We did our first conference that we've done a long time over in the UK. We did it in Manchester last year. And we had 1,900 people come. And the majority from the UK, some came from Europe. But the worship, like people's heart just to worship God with everything they have, to really believe Him. It's alive and well. It's alive and well. And so I do think sometimes, you just get an outside perspective where you're like, no, God really is doing some pretty significant thing. And listen, the UK is, I'm not just saying this because I'm in the UK right now. The worship movement that's come out of the UK, the prayer movement that's come out of the UK, the evangelism movement with Alpha that's come out of the UK, there have been some pretty significant things.
True, yeah. Not
100 years ago. We're talking about in recent years that's come out of the UK that's touched the world. And so, and listen, my view on this stuff, there's a book called The Cure of All Ills. It was written by an intercessor in the 90s. It's a fascinating book. It has maybe the ugliest cover you've ever seen, but it's a fascinating book she talks about that. She tracks that when God pours out His Spirit, it's at the lowest times in society. So when the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, these different times in history, society was at a moral low. It was at a societal low. It was at an economic low. It curved down, trended down, and then God showed up, and everything changed. And you can read throughout Scripture, you can see throughout history that it's some of the darkest times, some of the lowest times. Yeah. So some of these statistics we see, for me, honestly, I'm like, all right, this is a perfect this is when God shows up. Yeah. This is when He comes. And but I would say this, the depth of Christianity in the lives of people, the commitment is going deeper. So even though some people who say, I no longer before it was a social thing, in America at least, I don't know if it might be over here too, it's like I associate with church from a social aspect, not from and they're no longer feeling the pressure to do it socially anymore, and it's showing up statistically. Yeah. But I don't think that's changing what God's doing.
Sure. There's a number of sort of, I almost want to say theories about revival. I mean, you just hear certain things said a lot. For example, a lot of people say we won't see revival until the church is cleaned up, until there's sort of true repentance in the church. Revival has to start sort of with us. Is there something in that? And is there something that feeds into your ministry there with helping Christians to kind of get a passion and a revelation of what God's doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the Lord comes and deals with the church. I think, we're called to disciple nations. We're called to give what we've been, freely give what we've been given. But it's very hard to disciple nations if it's very hard to see a nation, become whole and healthy if your own personal life is a mess. So I do think that the Lord comes, even as I think He comes and challenges the church in their marriages. We want to see marriage we want to see marriages restore the nation. And there's such a fight over marriage issues right now. But if you look at the church, the Lord has to come and say, listen, we have to go after this in our own lives. Yeah. So I absolutely do think that the Lord comes and says, at the end of the day, here's the reality. All we have to give is our lives. Yeah. All we have to give is our lives. So the Lord comes and says, I need to grow your life. I need to challenge what's going on with you. I need you to live whole and healthy. I need you to embrace a life of holiness. I need you to embrace a life of love. I need you to embrace a life of purity, because this is what I'm wanting to do in society. And so I think He does challenge us, absolutely. I think it starts with, and that's where the repentance and prayer and our hearts becoming awakened really comes from, is that the Lord's wanting to first deal with some things in the church.
And that brings us to your book called Rooted, The Hidden Places Where God Develops You. And one of the big ideas, I guess, is about how God wants to develop you before He develops your vision. And I was thinking that's not necessarily something that people want to hear, is it? That's not necessarily a popular message, is it?
No, because it's a long message. When I started in youth, I started in ministry when I was 19, so 21 years later, as I look back, my passion to write the book was what we all have in common, what me and you, the different ages that we are, what we have in common is we're in process. Yeah. Like God has us in a process. And I think that many people get kind of get derailed in the process. It's all the D words. It's the discouraged and, distracted and disillusioned and derailed in the process because they don't understand that God uses a process to develop them and that God's passionate about developing you. A vision, so a vision is a natural outflow of a healthy life.
Yeah.
And so what I want to do is come alongside people and say, listen, when the Lord plants a seed in your life, so a word, a dream, a passion, a vision, when he plants a seed in your life, the next step is not fruit. The next step is roots. And I would say the most important growth that happens is the root system because John 15 says that we're not just to bear fruit, we're to bear fruit that remains. So all healthy, lasting, impactful fruit is attached to a healthy, developed root system. And this is, especially in our society, we've lost a little bit of the agricultural concept. We're just so rushed that we forget sometimes that this is the life of David. We use the early life of David as the backdrop. He was a preteen when Samuel came to him. And Samuel came, Samuel said, here's a word, and he anointed him. But it was almost 2 decades later that he stepped into being a king when he was 30. Well, those 2 decades, the Lord developed his life. The Lord developed a root system in him, and it comes in different soils and things. But the Lord does this. And I think a lot of people don't recognize that when the Lord plants a seed in your life, the next step is now a process where he's going to develop a root system. And that root system is underground, it's in hiding, it's dirty, it's not linear, it's messy. And that's where we get hung up sometimes. We're so frustrated because God's not developing my vision. And I'm like, God's developing you. He's developing a root system. He's looking to build your trust.
Yeah.
He's looking to, all the things that he wants to do in the process. So that's really, I just want to encourage, I think once people realize like, oh, this is what God's doing in my life. Just because you don't see anything on the surface doesn't mean growth isn't happening. And so a lot of people are like, I'm so frustrated because I don't see God doing anything. I'm like, he's doing a lot. It's just in your internal world. It's just below the surface. And again, it's the most important growth. And so I'm trying to get people to have a value for the internal root systems that God's trying to develop in our life. You talk about revival. Here's the deal for me. If we don't allow God to develop our lives, we're never going to bear fruit that remains in cities. And so my passion is for people to bear fruit that remains, but that means you got to have a value and a vision and a passion for root systems, not just fruit.
Yeah. It seems, I think what you're saying is very applicable to the kind of culture we live in where we want everything instantly.
Yes.
And we do. We have everything at our fingertips, don't we, with, the technology that we have today. And yet often God is doing something much slower, kind of behind the scenes.
And here's why. We live in a technological age. So the information age, the digital age, it brings, the technological age is both beautiful and stunting in, we don't even understand process sometimes. So when the Bible was written, when Jesus taught, it was an agricultural age. They understood this. When somebody said a seed's planted, they would understand, okay, it's going to take some time now.
Yeah.
And that they're fruit trees, you plant a seed, it takes 7 years for something to bear fruit. There are some nut trees, the really expensive ones, that it takes 20 years. You plant a seed, and it's 20 years later that nut appears on the tree. So it's this kind of thing, and we have iPhones. Literally, we will go spend, I don't know how much they cost over here, but we'll go spend $900 for a new iPhone. Yeah. And when you say, well, what's it do? Well, what's different about it? It's faster. And they're talking literally seconds. They're talking that when they try to bring their phone up and it's 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000, that I will go buy a new phone so it's 1,000. We're talking I shaved a second and a half off load time. Yeah. So we have a hard time grasping the fact that our life is not technologically paralleled, it's agriculturally paralleled. Yeah. And that just because you get frustrated because the process is going slower than you imagined doesn't make it speed up. No. When you plant a seed, you can be as frustrated as you want. It doesn't make the seed grow quicker. No. You can't go buy, seed 2.0 because that seed's faster. Yeah. But we think like that. We're like, this computer is so old because literally it took 15 seconds to start. You know what I mean? That's where we're at.
So I wondered, coming back to sort of speaking for yourself personally, who are the kind of people who have really influenced you? And I guess in influencing you have influenced your ministry?
Well, for sure, Bill. Bill Johnson has just been a real dad in my life and shaped a lot of my thinking. So his passion for the kingdom, his passion just to serve, his passion to be generous, his passion for signs and wonders, his passion for the presence of God. Bill's one of the most unambitious men you'll ever meet. It's really crazy. He just wants to love God really well, love people well, and he's very unassuming that way. So he has shaped my life a lot. There's a guy named Lou Engle who has a prayer movement in the U.S. and different places. He shaped my life a lot in thinking movement, in thinking that God can do something significant, and that we can mobilize the church for great things, and prayer life. My passion for prayer really kind of came from being with him. And so those two men in particular have been really shaping forces in my life. As well, there's different people that maybe people wouldn't know that were just fathers in my life at Bethel, Danny Silk and Chris Valentin and Dan Fairley. And then there's been some really impactful books that I've read, to be honest with you. A guy named Andrew Murray, who, Andrew Murray, a prayer guy, Ian Bounds, a guy from over here, Arthur Wallace. Arthur Wallace wrote a book called In the Day of Thy Power that really kind of shaped my thinking around revival and different things. So, Catherine Kuhlman, there's just been different books. I read a lot of biographies in my 20s and 30s. Yeah. Just devoured biographies. So a lot of these past men and women that either wrote about prayer or lived it or revival shaped me a lot. But Bill probably, out of everybody, the most, his passion for the kingdom of humility has been big for me. And
we've talked a lot about all that's happened, all that God's done in you and through your ministry over the years. And here we are in 2016. I wonder, what do you think the future holds for you and for your ministry?
Well, hopefully we can just serve the church more effectively and better. I mean, my heart is really, obviously we want to see our own city in Sacramento impacted and reached for Jesus and the gospel. And then we just want to serve the body of Christ in the nations. We want to come alongside them, encourage them. I want to speak courage to people. I want to speak hope to people. I want them to leave with more courage than they had, and I want them to leave really understanding we have a living hope, and for them to understand who they are in Christ and their identity. So I think the future for us, just hopefully we can just become more effective in serving the body of Christ, and then in turn seeing that ignited into cities being saved and transformed.
Do you feel like you have a particular message for the UK? As someone who travels a lot, is there anything you feel like God is specifically saying to the UK church at the moment, or an area of ministry you're focusing on when you're here in the UK?
Yeah, obviously hope is alive and well is a message we carry right now. I have again, you talked about it. Europe in particular, UK and Europe, you guys are in the trenches you guys are in the trenches. A lot of what everybody would say is secular society, post-Christian, that type of stuff. You guys are in the trenches, and I just want to just encourage and speak hope and life to people, because God is doing significant stuff. He is doing some amazing things, and I think He obviously has great plans for the UK and Europe. And so, yeah, we come. We don't have the answer. We're not rolling in with here's the answer, here's the model, here's what you need to do. But we just have a heart to just get in the presence of God with people. If our heart is to introduce people to the presence of God. We don't have a corner on the market in that for sure, but we have a passion just to worship and gather together. And so there's something that happens when we gather corporately. I'm a firm believer that there are certain things you can only get one-on-one in the secret with Jesus. But there are some things as well that you get when you gather together with the family of God corporately. And so I just want to speak courage and hope and life to people. I want them to be able to understand. A lot of what we're going after right now, to be honest with you, is trying to make the connections to, we use the word revivalist, but we're actually saying, what's a revivalist look like in the boardroom? What's a revivalist look like in the classroom? What's a revivalist look like on the playing field? And in these different realms of society, because we all know what a revivalist looks like behind a pulpit. But the reality is 98% of the people we're talking to aren't going to change the world behind a pulpit, but they're called to change the world. So we're saying, well, what does that look like then in whatever realm you're in? God's called you to lead. God's called you to carry the heart for revival, although it may look different than me standing behind a pulpit. You won't stand behind a pulpit in your business, but you absolutely are called to carry the heart of revival into that situation. What does that look like? How do you find that? And we have a passion for this one right now. It's amazing how many people that don't stand behind pulpits feel like second-class ministers because they're not behind a pulpit. We're like, you're not a second-class minister because you're not behind a pulpit. In fact, we don't need you behind a pulpit. We don't want you behind a pulpit. We need you exactly where you are leading. Go lead exactly where you are, because we are going to see cities transformed when the church, not just behind the pulpit, but the church actually begins to lead in a significant way and bring the heart of God there.
I know a lot of people who go to Jesus Culture events, they feel like they've really met with God, had an incredible time. And this will maybe be, I don't know, on a Thursday night or whatever. And then they go back to their church on a Sunday, and it's quite different, and they struggle. And I wonder what kind of advice you'd have for people like that, who feel like they're really having a sense of the presence of God when they go to some of these big events. And it may not be a Jesus Culture thing, it may be some other Christian event. But actually on a Sunday in their church, they struggle.
Well, I think that one, we have to understand a little bit, although, conferences, and I love conferences, and all the ones, New Wine or Soul Survivor, all these gatherings that happen over here. There are a moment where people separate. There are a moment where, the top 30 people that are passionate for God from every church gather, and there's lights and the best worship leaders and all this type of stuff. So there's this anticipation. There's this. It's not just the level, but people are coming expecting something. I would really challenge people. Don't get critical. Don't get negative about your church or where you're at, but come and go after God just as hard there. So many times we come with anticipation to a conference, but we don't come with the same anticipation to the church service. And that's on you. You've got to come with great anticipation that anything could happen today. I'm going to come meet with God today, because he says when we gather, he'll come, And so I think if we can just stir the church to say, listen, every time you gather in a group of 5 people, in a group of 50 people, in a group of 500 or 5,000, come with anticipation that God is going to meet you there and that great things are going to happen. And listen, the guy playing the guitar may not be as good, honestly, just from a skill standpoint. But I remember years ago, it's very interesting. We had a situation come where the guy, this is years ago before we had much going on, we spent so much time doing lights and making sure that everything was great for the stage. And the guy that was running that, his grandfather passed away right before the conference. So we weren't able to put up anything. And it was so intriguing to me. The stage was super simple. There was no lights. There was no anything. And we had spent so much time in the years before on it. And when we went into worship, it was the same worship. It was so good. And I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, these lights, they actually don't, they just don't have the impact that I thought they would have. We still have them because we value excellence and things like that. But some of that stuff matters way less than we imagine. Yeah. You can encounter God the same way if you come with great expectation for God's going to meet me here.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, Banning, we're out of time, but thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you so much for having me, and we just are really just praying and standing with you guys over here.
That was my interview with Banning Liebscher from 2016. Decided to put it out on the Profile podcast today just for you. Previously aired on Premier Christian Radio. If you would like to hear more interviews, then please do have a look back through the Profile archive. We've got a whole host of interviews now building up, going back some time. And I'm really delighted to say there's loads more coming here on the Profile podcast. We really appreciate your continued support of what we're doing here on the Profile. If you're able to rate us on whatever program you use to get hold of your podcast, that would be a massive help. Please give us a rating. And the other thing that you could do for us is share this podcast, either the entire podcast series or perhaps point people to 1 or 2 episodes that you think they would enjoy. That really helps us as well. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you right here next week.